Tensions between Syria and Israel are flaring once again. Behind the scenes, the two sides have resumed dialogue mediated by Turkey and the US, following Israeli strikes in Damascus and southern Syria. Now, any talk of extending the Abraham Accords to include Syria, an idea that had quietly been circulating, faded fast after Israel launched a fresh wave of strikes on Syrian forces and infrastructure, including a dramatic hit in the capital broadcast live. With Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Shara, still struggling to consolidate power, the question now is whether the chaos could open the door for Iran to reassert its influence. Joining me to unpack this is Dr. Thomas Juneau, an associate professor at the University of Ottawa and former strategic analyst for Canada's Department of National Defense.
To actively work against the creation of a new Syria, whereas there is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity now. I don't see how that helps, obviously, the new Syria, but this could easily fall back against Israel itself.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran, a podcast that takes you beyond the headlines. Professor Thomas Juneau joins us now. Thank you so much for being here on Eye for Iran.
Thanks for having me.
Professor, before we get into the geopolitics, let's set the scene here. Tell us what is behind the violence in Syria, and in your answer, if you could just explain who the Druze people are for those who may not know.
So that's a complicated question to start off, but a key one to kind of set the foundations for the conversation. Basically, in December of 2024, the Assad regime falls after 14 years of civil war in Syria, but also after 54 years of extremely oppressive, brutal, and corrupt rule by the Assad family, right? It was Bashar, but his father from 1970 to 2000. So when the regime falls, not all the country's problems are resolved. Of course, at the core of the problems in Syria was the venality, violence, brutality, corruption of the Assad regime. But as the regime falls, it leaves behind a completely destroyed, devastated country. Devastated in terms of poverty, economically, devastated in terms of its infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, but also with extraordinarily deep social, political, ethnic, religious fault lines throughout the country. And the fall of the regime not only obviously doesn't resolve all of that, but lays it out in the open. So, what we're seeing now, and as much as I would wish for things to stabilize, I'm very afraid and pessimistic that they won't, is all of these ethnic, sectarian, political, social fault lines coming out in the open. Revenge killings, right? I mean, this is a country, and it really has to be said, not only for 14 years of civil war, but 54 years of just brutal rule by the Assad regime, multiple injustices, torture, and so on. So right now, what we're seeing, to take the specific example and to get to the point about the Druze, is these accumulated tensions that are partly the result of the civil war for 14 years, but go beyond that between various groups in the south of the country. But we could have a similar conversation in other parts of the country. In this case, between Bedouin populations, between Sunni extremists of various kinds, and the Druze. So who are the Druze? The Druze are a minority in the Middle East. There's only a small number of them, about 1 million, mostly found in 3 countries, Lebanon, Israel, and Syria. They are often referred to as an offshoot of Islam. So they kind of hived off from conventional Islamic practice or Muslim practice centuries ago, and have created micro societies in this small concentrated area of southern Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. It's a very closed society. A lot of their rituals are not well understood outside of Druze communities.
Yeah, it's meant to be a secret, right? Part of their faith, actually.
Part of it, yeah. And over the centuries, the Druze have often been very adept at balancing their relations as a minority, as a vulnerable small minority, changing their alliances in Israel, in Lebanon, in Syria, and what are those countries today, to be able to basically ensure their survival. So some Druze were aligned with the regime, the Assad regime, some were not, which today is partly what explains the emergence of these revenge killings.
So let's talk about Israel now. So how did Israel intervene in all of this? And more importantly, Professor, why?
So this is where there's an extra layer of complexity. As I said, there's a small Druze minority in Israel, and they have been, since the birth of Israel, fairly well integrated. The Druze are viewed as loyal citizens of Israel. Many of them have served in the military, including in difficult key combat positions. Inside Israel, among the Jewish majority, there is a lot of respect for this reality that Druze have served in the military. And from the Druze perspective, inside Israel, there's a fairly strong, in obviously not every case, but a lot of cases, fairly strong identification with the state of Israel. So now what is going on with these massacres of Druze in southern Syria, Israel has intervened with the pretext of wanting to protect the Druze minority in southern Syria. Now, there's a very fair debate to have. How serious is that? How genuine is that care that Israel is expressing about the Druze minority in southern Syria? There's a good case to be made that it's a bit of a pretext to intervene and to basically create a buffer zone in southern Syria from which nobody, extremist Sunni or anybody else, could eventually threaten Israel. There's probably a fair bit of truth to that. That being said, as a number of Israeli commentators have said, and I think there is a grain of truth to this, there is a degree of care in Israel for the well-being of Druze communities in Israel, but elsewhere because of their very special status inside Israel.
This brings me to my next question. There's pretty dramatic footage. I'm sure you saw it. It went viral of a Syrian anchor doing a live report, and suddenly there's an Israeli airstrike at a government infrastructure just behind her. Everything was caught on video when she had to dive for cover. And this comes after an Israeli minister, Amichai Chikli, who actually had on Eye for Iran after the Operation Rising Lion, publicly said that the president of Syria, al-Shara, should be executed. So at the end of the day, even with this pretext of protecting the Druze community that they have a connection with, what do you feel is Israel's endgame here?
I don't know. And that's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that. I understand from a narrow perspective Israel's objective of wanting to ensure its own security and create a secure zone, whether you call it a buffer zone or anything else, in southern Syria to make sure that that's an area from which nobody will be able to threaten Israel in the future. I get that from Israel's perspective. But right now, Israel is actively bombing, or has been actively bombing over the past few weeks and months, since December 24 for that matter, government infrastructure and the Ministry of Defense headquarters in Damascus. And I do wonder, and I fail to understand how that helps Israel in the longer term. And I get it that from Israel's concern, and it's sometimes hard outside, but if you sit in Israel's shoes, having had threatening actors, governments in Syria or elsewhere surrounding Israel, the perception of insecurity is acute in Israel, and that's understandable. But to actively work against the creation of a new Syria, whereas there is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity now, I don't see how that helps, obviously, the new Syria, but this could easily fall back against Israel itself, and we can dive deeper into this in your next questions. But what if the new Syria, led by Ashara, as you mentioned, what if it falls, or what if it's weaker? That creates openings for terrorist groups. That's not good for Israel. That creates openings for Iran to come back into Syria, and I think we're going to talk a bit more about that. That's obviously not good for Israel. Ultimately, what is good for Israeli security is a strong but not hostile Syria, right? I actually think the Trump administration has understood that. And I've been very critical of the Trump administration on many things as a Canadian, right? We have a lot to complain about. But the Trump administration's willingness to give them a chance, the new regime in Damascus, to lift sanctions, to de facto recognize them, I actually think that's the good way to go, to give all the opportunities for Syria to rebuild, to stabilize, to develop economically, and also not to threaten its neighbors, including but not only Israel. And I think the engagement that the Trump administration is proposing now is actually the way to go on this.
So let's dig deeper into that. As you mentioned, a weakened government, central government, sectarian clashes, that may give Iran an opportunity to seize this moment to regain their foothold. what is the Israeli government in some ways inadvertently kind of setting the path for Iran to regain their influence there?
And I think your question is very well formulated, and that's a risk. And that's why I'm saying that I don't understand the end game for Israel. Just to take a step back, as we know, right, for decades, the Islamic Republic of Iran was very close to the Assad regime in Syria. The Assad regime was close to Iran ideologically, politically. A lot of Iran's help to Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, would transit geographically through Syria. They were cooperating on a number of other things, supporting Palestinian groups in some cases, etc. In the mid-2000s, during the civil war, when the Assad regime becomes under serious threat, Iran and Russia, also a friend of Assad, really massively ramp up their support. And for almost 10 years, they succeed in ensuring the survival of the Assad regime until just the complete rottenness of the Assad regime makes it unsalvageable and it falls in December 2024. That is geopolitically one of the, if not the greatest loss for the Islamic Republic since its birth in 1979, right? That is a
It's
massive
huge. It's
loss
huge.
for Iran. Exactly. It doesn't prevent it from supporting Hezbollah, but it seriously handicaps its ability to help Hezbollah. And remember, Syria was the only state ally that the Islamic Republic has. Every other group that the Islamic Republic works with in the region, Hezbollah, the Houthis, are non-state actors. Near state actors in some cases, but there are not formal governments, right? So it's a huge loss. There is no doubt in my mind that the Islamic Republic will try, probably already is trying, to rebuild its influence networks in Syria, especially with dissatisfied elements and former regime elements, right? Alawites, which is the other minority in Syria, one of the other minorities in Syria. They were the core of the Assad regime. Assad himself was an Alawite. They are obviously dissatisfied with the new Syria. They do not feel that the new system has a place for them. There has been violence in western parts of Syria on the coast with Alawites on a number of instances in recent months. So to me, it's a no-brainer, even if I don't know the details because they're not publicly available. It's a no-brainer that over the months and years, Iran absolutely will try to rebuild its influence in Syria as a means to extend its influence, as a means to pressure Israel, as a means to build it, to keep its ties with Hezbollah and other, axis of resistance groups with remnants of the regime. What is the best way to prevent Iran from doing this? And obviously, I'm massively simplifying a much more complicated issue, but the best way to prevent Iran from rebuilding its influence in the new Syria is to have a strong new Syria, right? A strong government, a representative government that will have some degree of legitimacy with as much of the population as possible and will be able to act against Iran's efforts to penetrate Syria again. Weakening the new Syria goes exactly against that. And that's why, again, I struggle to see how Israel in the longer term is acting in favor of its own interests, one of its key interests being preventing Iran from rebuilding its presence in Syria.
And what message then does this send to the Iranian people and to the government of Iran? I say that in the context of Israel's preemptive strikes inside Iran, because to them, from their perspective, they were saying, well, there's a nuclear threat. There was October 7th and Iran's role. There is this sort of ring of fire that Iran created around Israel that helped to destabilize the country, right? And from their perspective, they felt that they were doing something to protect their own nation, and they were going in there for that reason. With Operation Rising Lion. But with Syria, I mean, it's a different story, right? You've got al-Shara, who actually prevented Hezbollah from gaining weapons that would then ultimately be used to hurt Israel. It took out most of any kind of Iranian or IRGC elements inside the country. And it didn't attack Israel when Israel was conducting preemptive strikes at the beginning after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. In fact, they actually said that they were wanting peace with Israel. We had Congressman Corey Mills, a U.S. Republican lawmaker, on the show on Eye for Iran just a few weeks ago. After he met with al-Shara, they were one-on-one. This is before Trump actually met with al-Shara, and Mills actually helped kind of pave the path for the two of them to meet. And he was saying that, yes, al-Shara was very direct and that he wanted to extend diplomacy and have normalization with the state of Israel. So in some ways, does Israel's actions in Syria embolden the Iranian regime in the sense that it helps with Iran's own argument saying, well, why should we make concessions? They're going to attack anyways. Or, this was never about the nuclear threat. Does this in some ways, I guess, embolden the Iranian regime?
So before I specifically answer the question on emboldening the Islamic Republic, and I think the answer to that is yes to some extent, I just want to emphasize a point that you mentioned in your question, which is Ashara's approach to Iran. As we know, Ashara, formerly Abu Julani, the new president of Syria, former Al-Qaeda, former extremist, for years was moving his movement away from its more radical elements, starting in the late 2010s and then in the 2020s. A lot of reasons to be skeptical, a lot of reasons to be suspicious, given this past. Since his seizure of power in December 2024, Ashara has been pragmatic on many elements. For example, he has been somewhat pragmatic in his willingness to engage with Russia. You would think that he could be very hostile to Russia because Russia was so firm in supporting Assad and ensuring his survival alongside with Iran. But he's pragmatic on that aspect, and he gets it that, good or at least not bad relations with Russia, an important power, is essential to the survival of his new regime. On one thing where he has been intransigent, though, is Iran. He has been very clear that he is not forgiving the Islamic Republic. He has been working hard to block with his limited means, right? I mean, he leads a very weak government. Let's remember that. He has been exerting a lot of effort to block, attempts by the Islamic Republic to reestablish its foothold in Syria, to block smuggling links with Lebanon. It's a very porous border, right, with Hezbollah. So there is potential here for Israel, for the US, for Western allies to have a common interest with him, to work with him on countering the Islamic Republic. As you said, Israel has been bombing a lot of former IRGC assets inside Syria. It did that before December 2024, and it has been continuing to do it. Ashara has not been actively opposing that, to some extent because he really has no choice. He's too weak to be able to stand up to Israel. But still, there's a degree of pragmatism here, right, of recognizing the limits of his power and recognizing that it's in his interest to block Iran, to block Iranian influence in Syria. To get back to the second part of your question, what message does it send when Israel not only hits Iranian and former Iranian assets in Syria, but actively hits the new Syrian government, the new Syrian regime? I think it sends a very negative message. I think it sends a negative message to Syrians who have, in the vast majority of cases, no love for Iran and what it did in their country for 15, 14 years. It sends a negative message to the Sharia administration itself, which has clearly expressed its willingness to work with the US, to work with the international community, which has clearly said that it has no hostile intentions towards its neighbors, including Israel, which I believe, if only on pragmatic grounds, because Sharia has been very aware of the limits of what he can do. Right, whatever ideologically remains his beliefs or not. And ultimately, I don't know where ideologically he actually stands. But I have seen a clear willingness on his part to want to rebuild Syria and to recognize the limits of his own power, the weakness of his own regime. Israel is, by bombing his Ministry of Defense headquarters, by bombing his military, by bombing the country, by intervening and destabilizing the situation in the south, Israel risks pushing him in a corner where he's not for the moment, and that is risky.
And what message is that sent to just regular, everyday Iranian people, of many of who obviously oppose their own government, when they see, in some ways, the, I guess, arguments that their own government is making as being potentially correct in this sense?
Well, there's been a lot of conflicting messages sent to the Iranian people in recent weeks, in recent months, basically, since October 2023. a majority of the Iranian people, I think we understand that now, do not support the Islamic Republic. I've always liked to separate the people of Iran in three categories. I'm unable to give specific numbers because we just don't know them. There's one minority that actively supports the regime. Is it 10 or 15% or 18% of the population? I don't know, but it's a minority, not a tiny, but not a huge one. You've got a minority growing that actively opposes the regime. But you've also got a mass in the middle that doesn't support the regime, but fears the consequences of another revolution, fears the brutality of repression if they go down in the street, which is why we don't see, with the partial exception of 2009, massive numbers in the streets, millions in the streets. It's fear, right, of repression, fear of what could come next. So to me, for American policy towards Iran to succeed, a key actor is that mass in the middle. Is it 40, 50, 60, 68%? I don't know, but it's that mass in the middle to encourage them, to support them, to send messages of support unions, support NGOs, support media, etc., inside Iran, in that middle, to try to move them towards, that minority that opposes the regime. Policies that are counterproductive, like bombing the Syrian regime, which I don't think registers very highly in Israel, but remains as part of a broader package of policies that are not counterproductive, I think are not sending the right message to that mass in the middle, which is really where the US and its many allies, Israel, Europeans, and others, have to focus some of their efforts.
And what about Trump? Apparently, he was also caught off guard by Israel's actions inside Syria. You mentioned that Trump is trying to give al-Shara, a chance. He lifted the sanctions. When I spoke to Congressman Corey Mills on I4Iran, he talked about how, there are minorities, there are women who are not wearing a hijab, there are Christians, etc., within his own government, and he is actually making an effort, no matter how ideologically he actually thinks at the end of the day, we don't know what that is. What message does that send to you in terms of, Trump being caught off guard by Israel's actions inside Syria? What does that say to you?
Well, I mean, I think that the first thing to say, like I said a few minutes ago, I've generally agreed with Trump's approach to the new Syria. I rarely agree with a lot of the things that Trump does, but on this, I think he's got it right. That being said, there's always two things to remember about Trump, whether it's about the Middle East, domestic politics, its relations with allies, Canada, Europeans, whatever. He changes his mind a lot. He's unpredictable, and he's got a very short attention span. Right? He may be annoyed by something, for example, Israel bombing southern Syria. He may be caught off guard. He may be annoyed. He may disagree with it, but he's going to move on very quickly. And whether it's going to have any kind of consequences at all for U.S.-Israel relations or for U.S.-Syria policy is very unpredictable.
So we won't necessarily see it in policy is what you mean, right? Like it won't translate
exactly.
then to...
So whereas with a more conventional American president, Republican or Democrat, you would more likely see consequences for that clear disagreement between an American president and an Israeli policy. In this case, things are so unpredictable that I'm not sure that it actually matters. I do get the impression that he sees daylight between Netanyahu and himself on the issue of Syria. There have been a lot of media reports that he was irritated. First of all, he doesn't like being caught off guard, period. But that he disagrees with what Israel has been doing in Syria. But I'm not sure that it's going to have significant consequences right now. I mean, Trump has disagreed with Israel on a number of things, right? Syria, but remember the ceasefire with the Houthis about 2 months ago. That ceasefire completely caught the Israelis off guard. Netanyahu did not agree with it, but Trump kind of threw Israel under the bus on that one because that's what he wanted to do at that point. And then just a few weeks later, he was more than willing to work with Netanyahu to bomb Iran when that came in the 12-day war in June. So he's extremely unpredictable and has a very short attention span on a lot of these issues. So I expect this to kind of be the case on Syria too.
So, and obviously there are talks behind closed doors happening between Syria and Israel. And like we mentioned before, there was talk of normalization between the two nations, which would have been historic, kind of an extension of the Abraham Accords. Do you think that window has now closed? Or can they recover from this?
I don't think there really was a window for Syria to join the Abraham Accords. There have been a lot of media reports of private talks between Israel and Syria. I would have been extremely skeptical, even before what happened in the last few weeks, that
And
that
why
would
is
have
that?
led to Syria joining the Abraham Accords. I think there was a window, to stay on the issue of a window, for an understanding, more or less tacit and implicit, between Israel and Syria to stabilize things. But I doubt that Ashara would have been ready to commit to the Abraham Accords. I don't think the Syrian people are there. I think his government is too weak. I think the reality, whether we agree with it or not, is that there would have been tremendous opposition within Syria among the population, but also among his very loose coalition that is in power now. I think Ashara might have been pragmatic enough himself personally to do it, but others around him would not, and the system, the people would not have been ready for that. It would have been too destabilizing on the Syrian side. Again, whether one thinks it would have been a good idea or not. So I would have been extremely skeptical that there would have been an actual window for Syria joining the Abraham Accords as of a month, 2 months ago. That being said, I think that these talks were promising to at least stabilize things at the border, to come with some kind of implicit understanding, a very diluted version, if you want, informally, of a normalization between Israel and Syria. I think that window has been very much weakened now because of what Israel has been doing. But I think in the midterm, it could very well still be there because, again, going back to the point, I think Ashra is a realist. In many ways, he remains an ideologue in the back of his mind, but he's also been a realist, and he understands that if he wants to stabilize Syria and rule over it and not see his new regime fall, he needs to stabilize borders. He needs to stabilize relations with neighbors, which again is why he's been playing nice with Russia, despite all the baggage, which is why he's been keen to get a lot of support from Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular. The UAE was very skeptical of his regime at the beginning, right? They did not have a favorable view on him early on. He's been patiently working on that. He's been having some success with the US, and I think he wants to continue on that front, and with the Europeans too, to get sanctions lifted. With Israel, it's arguably not going in the direction that he wants, but I think he will patiently continue at that level. But actual Abraham Accords with Syria, I think we're a long way from that in the best of cases.
And how would he stabilize that border then, in terms of, if this really does boil down to Israel, like you said, the issue of the Druze? Is he able to prevent these, I guess, radicals that may be associated with his government from committing atrocities? And are the Druze themselves, are they committing atrocities on their side as well against the Bedouins? Like, how is this working?
So first of all, atrocities have been committed by multiple sides on multiple other sides, right? It is not a clean cut. There are good guys and there are bad guys in what is going on in southern Syria. It's far more complicated than that. Druze militias have themselves committed atrocities too. Let's be clear on that. They have been victims, but they have been perpetrators too. Who have been the perpetrators of atrocities against the Druze? There have been some Bedouin actors from southern Syria who, for very complicated reasons, have difficult relations with some of the Druze actors in the south. There have been Sunni, more or less extremist militias, some of them associated with the new regime. But remember, right, Sharia does not preside over a unified regime that he fully controls. What we call the Syrian regime now is a still building, still emerging coalition of rebel groups that overthrew the Assad regime. Some of them, Ashara has good control over them, some of them not so much. And it's the latter category that have been involved in those atrocities. Um, so, what does Israel want, and how can Ashara stabilize relations? I don't think Israel purely wants an end to the atrocities on the Druze. I think it does want that, but it also has been using that as a pretext. I think what Israel wants, at least in part, is a buffer zone in southern Syria that goes beyond the Golan Heights that Israel has occupied since 1967, to make sure that there's a demilitarized of some sort zone in southern Syria from which nobody, whether it's Ashara or anybody else, can threaten Israel in the longer term. And that's problematic for any Syrian government, whether it's Ashara or another one in the future, because it is, from their perspective, and if you look at it from Damascus's perspective, this is an occupation of their country. And this will be very difficult for Ashara or any other leader in Damascus to accept. So it's going to be difficult, and there will not be a resolution to this in the short term.
So did Syria cross over into that demilitarized zone, or are you saying that Israel just wants an extension, make it bigger?
I'm saying that at this point, these are gray lines. These are not clear lines. So what exactly is the extent of the buffer zone, the demilitarized zone, however we want to call it, that Israel wants in southern Syria? How far does it want it to go beyond the Golan Heights into southern Syria? I don't know at this point. How much of this will Damascus be willing to accept as it tries to stabilize things? Of course, ideally, from Damascus's perspective, there will be no Israeli buffer zone in southern Syria. But faced with Israel saying, well, sorry, guys, we're not going anywhere, which is Israel's position right now, is there something that de facto Damascus will have no choice but to accept, even if it won't say it publicly? That's going to have to be part of all of these power plays in the coming weeks, months, and possibly years.
Is there any evidence to suggest that A, Iran still has some influence inside Syria, and B, that they could potentially have their fingerprints on some of the sectarian violence in terms of helping to start it, if you will, so that it's not necessarily an organic process? Is there any evidence of that at all?
So in the south, Iran has much less of a presence there. Iran, I think we don't understand well how much of a presence Iran maintains in post-Assad Syria. Its presence has collapsed. IRGC officers, and there were probably hundreds of them as of December 2024, they fled. A number of pro-Iran militias in Syria fled to Iraq, right across the land border. That was not too complicated. There was, for example, a growing Houthi presence in Syria, right? The Houthis from Yemen, pro-Iran. They had been developing a presence in Syria. According to multiple reports, they also fled overland to Iraq. Hezbollah guys who were in Syria fled back to Lebanon pretty quickly. The issue, the opening for Iran is that there are regime elements, regime remnants in Syria, some of them Alawites. There are former pro-Iran militias, some of them Alawites, but not all of them, in Syria. They are not all dead, to be kind of blunt about this, right? Because the Assad regime collapsed. It fell apart in days. If you go back to that crazy time in December 2024, they were not all killed in a long war. So they still exist, right? And the fact that they were not killed, and it's a bit crude to say it this way, but the fact that they were not all killed means that they still exist somewhere. A lot of these Alawite army units are in the mountains in the northwest of the country in zones that are predominantly Alawites. I don't know for a fact, but knowing how Iran operates, I have zero doubt that Iran maintains contact with a number of them and is thinking about options, plans, concrete plans, not fuzzy ideas, to rebuild some of its influence networks in Syria. Of course, Iran will be completely unable to rebuild the dominant influence it had in Syria until December 2024, when it was, along with Russia, very influential. But I have no doubt, is cash flowing to some of these actors? My guess would be yes. Weapons, that's hard for now, especially because Ashraf's government, going back to our earlier point, has been so keen on preventing a reemergence of Iran's influence in Syria. But at some point, I do assume that Iran will try to ramp up that support. And again, bringing back to one of our core points in our discussion today, the more unstable the new Syria is, the more it creates openings for Iran to rebuild its influence.
And one thing that, well, at least I found interesting from when I interviewed Corey Mills, the congressman that I told you about, was that when he traveled to Syria and met with al-Shara, he was telling us that the whole telecommunications system in Syria is still actually run by Iran.
I mean, Iran had major investments in Syria, in mines, in various other economic assets, including telecoms. And that, in many ways, some of those networks, right? Not just military and security networks, intelligence networks, militias, but also the economic presence that Iran had. A lot of that has collapsed, but a lot of it is still there, even if it's underneath the surface. And again, that the best way to counter that is a strong Syria, right? And a weaker Syria will not be able to do that.
Speaking of a strong and weaker Syria, I just wanted to read you this social media post by a Syrian activist, Rawan Osman. She posted to social media this: "One thing is crystal clear to me. Syria must be divided. What unity are we still pretending to chase when the Sunni majority has shown no hesitation to humiliating, displacing, and even slaughtering non-Muslims? She went on to say that al-Shara has failed. What do you make of this?
I think it goes back to the point that I made at the beginning of our conversation on the depth and breadth of multiple fault lines inside Syria as a result of not just 14 years of war, but 54 years of Assad family rule. When you have such brutality, such corruption, such violence, such venality in the governance of a country, when that system falls, a lot of these fault lines come out of the open, and these are open, festering wounds in many cases. And that leads to a really difficult question that I think we're not asking enough, and that's why that's a relevant quote. Is a united Syria possible? Right? Is a united Yemen possible, right? With the Houthis in the north and the separatists in the south. And we could ask similar questions for other war-torn countries in the Middle East or beyond. And in many cases, the default position of the international community is to support a united Syria, to support a united Yemen. In many cases, that is ultimately the right position. But maybe sometimes we need to challenge that thinking a bit more and ask, is it feasible? Is it really the best outcome, a united Syria? It might be, because it's absolutely true to say that there are these fault lines with the Druze in the south, with the Kurds in the northeast, with the Alawites in the northwest, and other minorities. And even within the Sunni community, there are a lot of divisions too, right? Does it automatically mean that fragmentation has got to be the solution? Maybe, but not necessarily, because fragmentation would not be peaceful. Right? Fragmentation would be an extraordinarily complicated and bloody process that may not lead to a better outcome of the imperfect unity that we have now, the very imperfect unity that we have now. So I think that the bottom line is that for Syrians, but also for friends of Syria, in Europe and the US and elsewhere, that question has to be asked. How do we rebuild a united Syria? But is it really the only option moving forward? It's a hard question to have. It may open difficult debates, but it might be necessary to also ask that in the context of Syria, but also other countries too, for that matter.
Yeah, sometimes it's not necessarily about finding the solutions, but asking the right questions to get to those solutions eventually. So Tom Barak, the U.S. Syria envoy, recently in an interview with the Associated Press said that Israel would rather see Syria, quote, fragmented and divided. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that's true, though. I think when somebody says that about Israel's thinking and puts that in parallel or besides the quote from the activist that you just read, these are completely different interpretations, right? That activist wants a fragmented or wants a breakup of Syria, or some activists. I don't want to pretend to speak in the name of that activist in particular, but to say it's irreparable, it is beyond reconciliation. We need to break the country apart so that different minorities can have the right to self-determination, the Kurds in the northeast, and so that they can build their own country in a safe and secure way to, as the best way to protect their dignity, their security, etc. That's not what Israel has in mind, right? What Israel has clearly shown that it is doing is that it views its own security in a narrow sense as best ensured by a weak and fragmented Syria, in which no actor will be able to emerge in a position to threaten Israel again. That actor could be Ashra. In Israel, there is a lot of skepticism, and if you read Israeli media or social media, there is a huge amount of skepticism that Ashra can be trusted moving forward. There are good grounds for that, of course, given his past, or anybody else, right, in a post-Ashra administration, which could happen at some point, right? To me, though, that is, even though given Israel's trauma after October 2023, sorry, the extreme skepticism that you see in Israeli security thinking right now, I think it comes from somewhere, and I think we would be blind not to recognize that, the trauma of October 7th that led to that. But ultimately, I think countries like the US, like Canada, like the European Union, who maintain good relations with Israel despite all the tension, I think it is their role to try to pressure Israel in saying, we get it. We respect and understand your security concerns. We want to help ensure Israel's security, but that's not the best way to do it.
And Professor Juneau, let's talk about Turkey's role in all of this, because Erdogan is obviously aligned with al-Shara. They're part of the mediation talks along with the U.S. In terms of Israel and Syria. But historically, Israel and Turkey also have a lot of conflict. So where do you see this all going? Do you see another kind of front opening up? Because every time I look at the Middle East, I see, oh, there's another front that's opened up in this war.
I mean, Israel and Turkey have had an interesting, fascinating, complicated relationship for decades. Turkey has recognizes Israel and has had close military and security and intelligence cooperation with Israel for decades. But especially with the rise of Erdogan in recent years, there has been a rise in tension. Sometimes beneath the rhetoric, there's still some security cooperation going on between the two countries, but even that has slowed somewhat in recent years. Turkey is arguably the geopolitical winner of the fall of the Assad regime, because Ashara and HTS, the group that he used to lead, was based in northwestern Syria, so at the border with Turkey, and de facto he was receiving some Turkish support. He is close to Turkey in many ways, so now Turkey has an ally, a friend, ruling Damascus, which was not the case before. So from Turkey's perspective, that is a huge win. Also, keep in mind, by the way, that Ashara is not a proxy of Turkey in the sense that he's not a puppet of Turkey, right? But Turkey actually supports groups in the north central Syria, bordering Turkey, that are proxies of Turkey. If you define proxy in terms of command and control relationship, these groups occupy parts of north central Syria. They are being controlled and equipped by Turkey, and that gives Turkey a lot of influence in the north of the country too. So when Israel bombs the new government in Syria, obviously that leads to a clash of interests with Turkey, which opposes these bombings. That is one among many other points of friction in the Israeli-Turkish relation: the management of post-Assad Syria, the war in Gaza, and multiple other points of friction between them. Will it lead to a new clash, as you said? I mean, no, in the sense that there won't be a Turkey-Israel war, and that's not going to happen. Geography separates them, and so on. They do remain pragmatic to some extent, but the tension is certainly very high.
Yeah, and when it comes to Turkey, there's also that relationship that they have with the Syrian people. Of course, there was more than 1 million displaced Syrians living in Turkey for more than a decade as well.
And one of the objectives of Erdogan in Turkey is to try to steer, and in some cases force, the repatriation of as many of those Syrian refugees as possible. In the early years of the war, in the 2010s, Turkey, and we criticize Turkey a lot, and usually for good reasons. But Turkey was very good at hosting Syrian refugees. It was a humanitarian policy. It welcomed them. It was
I heard it
difficult. There
directly
was
from Syrian
opposition.
refugees. Yeah, they said it themselves.
And these were people who had nowhere else to go given the devastation. There were more than 3 million of them. And Turkey, was not always perfectly nice with them, but by and large hosted and welcomed them. Over the years, as the Erdogan government took a more authoritarian turn, took a more nationalist turn, became more and more hostile to Syrian refugees among many segments of this Turkish population. As there was more and more hostility to the millions of Syrian refugees,
And attacks on them
taking
as well.
jobs, attacks on them. The effect that it was having on housing, on healthcare, on education, and so on. So now, from Erdogan's perspective, one of the many variables that he's keeping in mind in his equation as he thinks about Syria is how to steer the repatriation of as many of these Syrian refugees as possible.
Any concluding final thoughts on where this is all going?
I mean, I think we could go on for a long time, but I think one thing that we haven't directly addressed, and there are many, but one is the humanitarian situation inside Syria. Which is something that we, especially somebody like me who focuses on the grand geopolitics and the regional security, that's my focus. We tend to forget. Analysts like me, the international community, the media, the apocalypse of the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria, putting aside the sectarian, ethnic, religious fault lines, putting aside the grand geopolitics of the games that we talked about between Iran and Russia and Turkey and Israel and so on. There more than half of the Syrian population was displaced by the civil war. Some of them to Turkey and elsewhere. We welcome tens of thousands of Syrian refugees here in Canada, but also inside Syria. Many of them are not able to go back home because their homes were destroyed or their homes were stolen by regime or regime-affiliated militias. Now, of course, the geopolitics and everything that we talked about matters, and we can't just naively put that aside. But from the international community's perspective, there has got to be a parallel effort to help with the rebuilding of Syria on the humanitarian side. And one of the best ways to do that is to lift sanctions. Yes, let's be very prudent. Yes, let's be mindful that Ashra may take a turn for the worse in the coming years, and let's monitor that for sure. Let's not be naive about that. But sanctions, the ongoing effect of sanctions really prevents trade, which will have to be key to the rebuilding of Syria, the delivery of humanitarian assistance, bank transfers by the Syrian diaspora anywhere else in the world to send it back to Syria, and so on. So, let's try to keep that part in mind too, and encourage the rebuilding of Syria, which in the best of cases will take decades and cost hundreds of billions of dollars.
Then I wanted to ask you about MBS and his role then in terms of rebuilding Syria.
MBS has been cautiously but steadily engaging with the new Syria. He was skeptical. He was not necessarily a big fan of Ashra, the UAE even less so. But MBS, who has been much more pragmatic in recent years in his foreign policy compared to the crazy years of the second half of the 2010s, if you go back to the blockade of Qatar, the dispute with Canada, these days are gone, right? So he's cautiously engaging with the new Syrian regime, which I think is the right approach. He, I think, understands that a strong Syrian government, again, is the best way to counter the rebuilding of Iranian influence in Syria. So there's a reason why MBS was one of the key brokers in getting Trump to meet Ashraha just a few months ago. That amazing picture of the three of them next to each other, which if you had shown me that picture 10 years ago, I would have said, you are absolutely out of your mind to think that that could happen. So I think he is playing an important role to try to encourage the rebuilding of Syria, the stabilization of Syria's relations with its neighbors as much as possible. But like every other actor, his ability to actually steer events on the ground is limited.
Thank you so much for that fascinating conversation. I learned a lot from you, Professor Thomas Juneau.
Thanks for having me.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button. Also leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. And sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. We deliver what you need to know with top stories, key analysis, and exclusive reports direct to your inbox.